Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. Papa Boris here, playing some more chess. Now, I promise this is the Papa Boris channel, not the Rashid Nezhmetdinov channel, but I couldn't resist showing one more game by my favorite player before moving on to some other great players of the 20th century. Here, we have a game against Alexei Sokolsky. It was played in 1957, and this was a much more serious game than the one that I showed you last against Ermelin. Alexei Sokolsky was a pretty strong player. He was an international master. He did manage to pick up some wins against some pretty strong players. He beat David Bronstein, and he also beat Solomon Floor. So he was a pretty serious player, though not a grandmaster, very strong. He also was famous for playing the orangutan defense, developed by Tartakover, which is the first move b4. It actually became known as the Sokolsky opening, or Sokolsky's opening in the USSR, because he played it so much. Anyway, in this game, he was black against Rashid, and I introduced him just because I want to show that Rashid could definitely beat the best players, or even very strong players, not just patzers at your local chess dive. Rashid opens with e4, and after e6, we see the French defense. Rashid, being a gentleman, plays the regular old French defense, not any of these wacky variations, and then knight to c3, and bishop to b4 is the winnower variation. We've actually seen this before. Now, if you want to be aggressive in this variation, what you want to do is play e5, which is the advanced variation, though it may be a better idea to play a3 first. This forces black to put up or shut up, so to speak. If the black moves the bishop back, then you can play e5, and things are a little bit better for you. If the bishop takes on c3, then sure, black can win this pawn on e4, but white's looking rather pretty with queen to g4. Now, here, Nezhmetdinov perhaps didn't want his opponent to even have a chance of stopping this pawn from going to e5, which is very much in keeping with Nezhmetdinov's all pieces forward, damn the torpedoes mentality. So he gets the push in. Now, the thing about this is that this is not bad for black, because first of all, black plays knight to e7, developing that knight, and after this aggressive-looking queen to g4, black actually plays c5, attacking in the center. Yeah, white could take on g7 here, but the issue is that after black loses these two pawns, he gains one in the center, and this e-pawn is now very weak. White spent a lot of moves in the opening moving his queen, and like all of his pieces are totally undefended. Not to mention there's this issue of this knight's attacked and it's pinned to the king, so you have to start making moves like a3, and it's just not very great for white. So, Nezhmetdinov knew better. He played a3 right now, but this does allow a tactic, queen to a5. So the bishop is attacked, but if you take the bishop, then black gets your rook. So Nezhmetdinov here plays bishop to d2 to support his knight, and then after c takes d4, I gotta think that Nezhmetdinov had this planned. He doesn't meekly recapture on d4, allow black to develop his knight with tempo on the white queen. He goes ahead and sacrifices the exchange. He takes the bishop on b4 and lets the black queen take on a1 with check, no less. So just straight up giving up an exchange in the opening because, you know, I'm Rashid motherfucking Nezhmetdinov. His plan was that now after knight to d1, this black queen looks very awkward. This knight, in addition to blocking the check, is protecting the b2 pawn, and this queen's going to need a couple more moves to get back into the game at the very least. Now, his opponent, Alexei Sokolsky, probably should have played knight to g6 and just blocked the g-pawn from being taken. But perhaps he figured that this knight was going to get dislodged anyway with moves like h4, h5, or f4, f5, or knight to f3, knight to h4. And so he decided, you know, screw it, you can have your g7 pawn, I'm just going to develop my pieces and attack your e-pawn. As we mentioned in an earlier video about the French defense, it's often very important for white, if he does make this push to e5, to hang on to that pawn. And it's a little bit difficult for white to do here. Sure, f4 is an option, but it's a very, very weakening move, and white's already in a fairly fragile state here with these pieces and the black queen looming over the home rank. So Nezhmetdinov just plays b5. He's saying, all right, you can take the pawn. And perhaps black shouldn't have taken the pawn. It didn't seem to work out very well for him, but you be the judge. After knight takes e5, white takes on g7, forking the rook and this knight. And the plan now was that his opponent must have been thinking, okay, I'm just going to play knight to g6 and protect the knight and the rook at the same time. What's interesting is that this is actually a mistake, and here white starts to get the upper hand. The correct move would have been to play knight 5 to g6. It doesn't feel as intuitively appealing because it vacates the center square. It seems like it'd be better to have a knight on the center than a knight on e7. But here, black is already up material. He just needs to hold the fort. He doesn't need to go for like some kind of advanced positional play. And with this move, white actually gets to do a couple of things. First, he plays h4, threatening h5, winning the rook. So that has to be stopped with h5. And now, white plays rook to h3. So this rook is going to swing across the board with tempo. It's a rather ingenious maneuver, honestly. This idea of, okay, if I go h4, black has to deal with it, and then I get to play rook h3 and swing this rook over. Suddenly, this is looking pretty decent for white. And now it would really be nice if black didn't have a knight on e5 as a vulnerability against the white queen. You know, if the knight were on e7 and this knight were on g6, then the rook could actually go to g8, kick the white queen around a little bit. Maybe this other knight here could move somewhere or just sit tight and be a defender for the black king. But here on e5, it's just not a very effective piece. Now, Sokolsky here tried to pretend as if nothing was wrong and played bishop to g7. This is actually making his position worse. What he needed to do was play to rook to f8 to make sure that the rook was protected, and that would allow this knight to maybe move at some point. This bishop to d7 move is awfully optimistic and really underrates white's pressure. White plays knight to f3, challenging this knight in the center, and it's kind of a problem if you let if black were to let white take the knight, you know, then the knight's just dropped. You know, white's just straight up winning a piece here. So the knight is actually under threat. And you can see here where, yeah, maybe it'd be better if the knight were on e7 so this knight to f3 move weren't such a disaster. You can't really take this knight, or at least it's not great, because then after rook takes f3, this f7 pawn is threatened and black's position is crumbling. Even after black castles queenside, I mean, still, white can take this pawn or go to a3 and continue the attack. It's just not looking super hot for black. So black decided to try knight to c4, but this allows white to develop his last piece here, the bishop, with tempo by capturing the knight, and after the bishop is recaptured, white plays knight to g5. So Nezhmetdinov here is threatening to capture on f7 with some devastating consequences. I've looked at a lot of Nezhmetdinov games, and actually there's a fairly common running theme of his opponents castling queenside to try to get away from an attack. And I gotta say, it usually doesn't work out for them. And here, Sokolsky is basically admitting that he's goofed because white could just take on f7 and win the exchange. But Nezhmetdinov finds an even stronger continuation. He plays rook to a3. So a beautiful rook lift all the way across the board. The queen is now trapped and has to sit on b1 like a doofus. And white also gets to now take on a7. So this king is not safe in the slightest. Here, Sokolsky played c3. And the correct continuation for Nezhmetdinov would have been to take on f7 and win the exchange. Perhaps he was concerned about pawn takes bishop and king takes pawn, but there's really no follow-up here for black. This queen is completely trapped here, and white's just going to win a rook and have a devastating attack. But Nezhmetdinov made a slight mistake here. He actually took the pawn. And this gave his opponent one heartbeat of a moment to respond to the situation. Here, if Sokolsky had played king to b8, he would have been totally fine. If the rook tries to run away from the situation and move, then black can play e5, solidifying his pawn center. And if white takes on f7, black gets to play d3. And suddenly black is starting to get some counterplay here, and the white king is looking a little bit imperiled. For example, after the pawn takes on d3, we can have bishop to g4, threatening this knight. So here, the correct move was definitely king to b8, but Sokolsky goofed. He missed his chance. He played queen takes b5. And now after knight takes f7, there is no shenanigans with d3 because white can play knight to d6 check and fork the king and queen. So the queen's placement on b5 is a tactical disaster for black. Now Sokolsky has to make a bad move, king b8, which in this position isn't any good. And after white takes the rook on h8 and the knight is recaptured, the rook simply comes back to a1, and now it's looking fairly pretty. It is blocking off the king on the a file, and white's queen and dark squared bishop are ready to get to this diagonal and start threatening the black king's safety. The only thing that stands in their way is this knight on g6. It is worth noting that black had a slightly better continuation here. White here should have actually moved the rook to a1 first, and then taken black's rook? By taking black's rook right away, Nezhmetdinov goofed a little bit. He actually allowed Sokolsky to take on a7, which would have been a little bit safer for black. Black still would have lost here, but it would have been a little bit safer. Sokolsky missed it, though. He just casually recaptured on h8, and after the rook came back to a1, this was the position. The knight is attacked on g6. The only way really to protect it is to play bishop to e8. Another option would have been queen to e5, but that just drops the bishop on d7. So Sokolsky tried to hang everything together with bishop to e8, and Nezhmetdinov found the best move in this position, the very precise, almost computer-esque queen takes d4. And this is something that's a trademark of Nezhmetdinov, like the slow move that makes a threat, and suddenly, even though you have time, you can't defend against the threats that Nezhmetdinov is putting in front of you. So what's going on? Well, queen to d4 threatens queen to d8 checkmate. Okay, fine. Let's block the checkmate with bishop to d7. Problem is, now white plays queen to d6 check, and after the king moves, rook to a8 is checkmate. This is why, by the way, it would have been handy for black to have gotten rid of this rook when he had the chance. So, okay, I'll stop both of these mates. I'll play queen to c6. Problem now is after queen to d8 check and the queen blocks, white has this tactic, which is a fairly common tactical theme when one queen blocks another, the deflection. Rook to a8 sacrifices the rook, but it pulls the king away from defense of the queen, so white wins black's queen and is also mating black in a few moves. Another option that black could have tried here is to play queen to d7. This, I think, is the most interesting one, and I wish that Sokolsky had played it. I guess he didn't because he saw the writing on the wall after bishop to f4 check. The idea with this check is if the king moves, then the rook to a8 is checkmate. But if you take the bishop, then the knight on g6 is being deflected from its protection of these squares, and after white recaptures the knight, black is in big-ass trouble. If the king goes to c8, we still have checkmate on a8. And if the queen blocks, then we again have this trick of rook to a8, deflecting the black king from protection of the queen. White is now up a queen for a rook, and this is a totally winning endgame. There really isn't anything else for black to try. If we try to go to f7 to protect against queen d8, this still works. This queen d6 kind of slow burn mate in 2 is just so ridiculously tricky to stop. One more move I'll show is b6. This would have actually allowed, according to the engine, a mate in 13. The idea is that after queen to d8 check, king to b7, white has queen to a8 check, and now we begin a little king chase. And you can see, even without going through all the rest of the moves, that the king is now completely exposed, and it's only a matter of a few more checks before white can mate the black monarch. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe if you did. Oh yeah, there's one more thing that the engine is actually recommending. Yeah, I should show you this other possibility. King to c7, there we go. If king to c7, then white has to put his rook on a8, threatening to go queen to d8 check. And there's no, like, bishop to f7 business because then the rook is getting dropped and black's just down in material. If you try going queen to e5 check to exchange away the queens, white actually allows this and then plays bishop to f4. Now black's pieces are equal to white's pieces. The material is equal except for Nezhmetdinov's 2 extra pawns, but black's pieces are in horrible shape. This bishop's pinned to the rook, this knight's pinned to the king. After the king goes to d6, white doesn't even have to do anything. White can just play knight to e3. Okay, great. Now what do you do, black? The threat is knight to c4 check, picking up this knight, and there's just no way for black to deal with all of these pins and threats without losing some massive material. Okay, now for real, if you enjoyed this video, thank you so much for watching it. Please like and or subscribe, and I'll see you again soon with some more chess and other games. Take care, everybody.